The Factor was still talking when I finished the first manifest. He'd been at it for about 20 minutes by then, standing in the middle of Bay 11, with his mantle fanned out, and his 6 manipulator arms arranged in what I assumed was his species' version of a boardroom posture. 2 of his arms held data slates. 2 were clasped in front of him. The last 2 moved while he spoke, weaving slow patterns in the recycled air that probably carried more meaning than his words did. The Verek Syndicate, he explained, had an interest in the cargo rotation running through Orvith 3's outer docking arm. They were prepared to facilitate the process. They required in return a modest consideration: Bay 11's sealed hold, reclassified as Syndicate managed for the next 4 rotation cycles. Simple paperwork, he said. A signature. My signature, specifically, since the Bay supervisor's mark was the one the IWC manifest registry recognized. I wrote down the intake tonnage for Hall 37 and moved on to the departure schedule. He repeated the offer, more detail this time. The Syndicate's network, he said, extended through 14 waystation clusters in this corridor. Shipments that had his organization's classification mark moved faster through the outer lanes. Shipments that didn't sometimes experience delays. Damage in transit, the kind of thing that was difficult to trace. He had a pleasant, modulated voice for a cephalopod. Some of them used acoustic translator patches that clicked and buzzed. His was smooth enough that you stopped noticing the chromatophore shifts in his skin while he spoke, which I suspected was the point. I asked him whether he wanted coffee. We had a machine in the supervisor's office. It made something that approximated coffee well enough that I'd stopped thinking about the real thing years ago. He said no. I said that was fine, and wrote down the departure window for the Orvith-Kessel connector. The 2 enforcers behind him hadn't moved since they'd come in. They were bigger than he was, a different subspecies of the same cephalopod lineage, I guessed, or a different species entirely that had adopted similar body language. They stood with their arms loose, and their chromatophores cycling through a pattern that, in the Verek Syndicate's orbit, I understood meant ready. Not attacking, not retreating, holding a position. I'd seen the same thing on cargo docks from here to the Peleth corridor. Different species, same basic message. I noted their position, 3 meters behind the Factor, 1 on either side of the service hatch, and went back to the manifest. "You're not concerned," the Factor said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've got 3 manifests," I said. "I'm concerned I won't finish before shift change." He let that sit for a moment. His skin ran a slow amber pattern, which I didn't know specifically, but which didn't look like pleasure. He told me, more directly this time, what the Syndicate's interest in Bay 11 actually was. The sealed hold contained bonded relay components, bound for the Orvith Institute. Civilian equipment, non-military, but the kind of thing that had secondary commercial value in the right markets. His organization had buyers. The reclassification I'd sign would give his transport team access for 1 rotation, during which the cargo manifest would update to reflect a partial shipment loss, standard attrition, the kind the Institute's insurance carried. Everyone compensated, no enforcement flag triggered. I wrote down the departure window for Hall 38. "You understand what I'm telling you," he said. "Yes," I said. And I'm writing down the departure window for Hall 38. He moved then, not toward me, but he repositioned himself so that his 2 enforcers were visible past his shoulder, the way a man at a negotiating table might lean back to let you see the people standing against the wall. I'd seen that too. The detail that had always struck me about that move was how much it depended on the person across the table having a specific relationship with their own survival. A clear preference for it, an anxiety about its absence. The move was a reminder: these people are here, and you should factor them in. I factored them in. Then I set my stylus down. The Factor stilled slightly. In my experience, that was when most people thought the conversation was about to change, when the one who'd been quiet finally stops doing the small administrative thing they'd been doing and looks up. He was right that it was a change, just not the kind he expected. I asked him what his shuttle's cargo tonnage was. He said he didn't see what that had to do with anything. I told him I was trying to calculate how many of his people could leave at one time, so that I could figure out how long it would take to clear the bay after we were done here. I wasn't planning on going anywhere myself. I had a shift to finish, but I wanted to know if his group needed 2 runs or 1. He looked at me for a moment. His chromatophores did something I hadn't seen before, a fast, irregular flicker that wasn't part of the ready pattern his enforcers were running. It cycled twice, and then flattened into a dull, even gray. I picked up the stylus and went back to the manifest. "You're not afraid," he said. "Not especially," I said. "Why not?" I finished the line I was on. "Because you've explained your position very clearly, and I've explained mine, and I don't think there's a misunderstanding here. You want access to a sealed hold, and I'm not going to give it to you. That's the whole of it. There are consequences," he said, "for supervisors who don't cooperate." "I know," I said. The bay was quiet for a bit after that. The ventilation cycled. Bay 11 had an older system, one of the first-generation recirculators that ran on a 4-minute loop you could hear if the room was still enough. I'd been listening to it for 3 years. It was a comfortable sound. He tried a different approach. He told me about 2 other waystation supervisors in the Orvith cluster who'd declined similar arrangements. He didn't describe what had happened to them in explicit terms. He described the outcomes, equipment failures that had come back on the supervisors personally, license reviews triggered by anomalies in their cargo logs, anomalies that had, on close inspection, been introduced by parties the supervisors couldn't identify or name for an adjudicator. He presented these cases with the patient, methodical quality of a man who had rehearsed them, which meant they were probably real, which meant they were meant to land. I asked him which IWC cluster those stations were registered under. He paused. "Why does that matter?" "Because if it's under Orvith Prime Registry, the license review process runs through a different adjudication stream than if it's under Pelith Secondary. The timelines are different. The documentation burden is different." I checked my figures against the register. I'm trying to understand how much advance notice I'd have. He was quiet again. The amber pattern in his skin returned, slower this time. "You've looked into this," he said. "I've worked transit cargo for 11 years, I said. "You learned the registry protocols. There's not a lot else to do on the night shift." At some point in there, the 2 enforcers had moved. I hadn't watched it happen. I was writing. But when I glanced up to check my figure against the wall register, they were closer. Maybe 1.5 meters. One of them was now to my left, rather than behind the factor. The repositioning was meant to be subtle. It was subtle. It just assumed a specific response in me. A tightening. A recalibration. And when that response didn't arrive, it sat in the room like a question that nobody answered. I wrote down a figure, checked it, and corrected the decimal. The factor spoke again. His voice had the quality of a man who has run a long negotiation and is reaching the part where the remaining options narrow. He told me that it wasn't too late, that the arrangement he was offering was genuinely advantageous, that supervisors who worked with the syndicate found their 3-year postings ran smoothly, found their renewal applications processed without friction. He used the word partnership. He made it sound like a reasonable thing. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it more or less sincerely. He'd been professional about it. Clean. He wasn't the worst kind of syndicate factor I'd heard of. The answer's still no. "Why?" he said, and for the first time he sounded like he actually wanted to know. I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because Bay 11 is my bay," I said. "The hold is sealed under my registry mark, and the contents are bonded to a recipient I have a contractual obligation to. That's the work. You're asking me not to do the work." I tapped the manifest register. "And I have 2 more of these to file." "Where are you from?" the factor said. His voice had changed slightly, not softer, exactly, flatter. "Kerath system," I said. "Which world?" 7. He said nothing. I wrote down the tonnage allocation for the morning shift's first priority load and checked my figures against the station register. "Class designation," he said. I told him 13. I didn't look up when I said it. I was checking the figures. But I heard what happened after. The 2 enforcers exchanged something on a frequency my translator didn't carry, low and fast. The factor's skin ran the irregular flicker again, longer this time. I heard one of the enforcers shift his weight, a small adjustment. the kind a person makes when they've been standing ready for a while and are quietly recalibrating whether ready is the right posture to be in. I knew what 13 meant in the outer lanes. Most species did. It wasn't a classification anyone advertised, and it wasn't the sort of number that came up in casual conversation, which meant that when it did come up, it tended to change the texture of the room. I'd had 11 years to get used to it. The factor had about 15 seconds. He was quiet long enough that the ventilation finished a full cycle. "You've been doing this work for how long?" the factor said. 3 years here, I said. Before that, 8 years on the freight line running the Peleth connector. Before that, the usual. What is the usual? Military service, 2 deployments. Nothing interesting. I crossed a figure out and corrected it. The freight line paid better, and the hours were more predictable. I've always liked predictable hours. The factor was quiet again. I heard him move. Not toward me. He turned, slightly, toward his enforcers. Something passed between them that my translator rendered as fragmentary noise, not enough structure to reconstruct. His chromatophores had gone to a steady, even pattern now. Not the ready color. Not amber. Something in the mid-range that I associated, in the cephalopod species I'd encountered, with the process of reassessment. He tried once more. I'll give him that. His voice was quieter, and the offer he made was a final version, stripped of the network access framework, stripped of the language about mutual benefit, stripped all the way down to the direct statement that I should understand what would follow if I didn't cooperate. "I understand," I said. "I said that already." "And you still?" "I've got one more manifest," I said. "I'd like to finish it." I heard him turn again. His 2 enforcers straightened slightly, the posture that wasn't an exit, but was the preparation for one. There was a pause of about 10 seconds where I was aware, in the way you're always aware on a Kerath-13 deployment, of exactly where everyone in the room was standing, and what the angles were, and what the options were, in the event that the conversation reached a different conclusion than the one I expected. It didn't. The factor walked out. His enforcers followed. I heard the bay hatch cycle shut behind them. I finished the 3rd manifest. It took about 4 more minutes. The tonnage allocation for the morning's 2nd priority load was slightly underlogged. The intake figures from the previous shift had a transcription error that would have flagged in the automated review, but I caught it manually and corrected it before it went to registry. The sort of thing that compounds if you let it run a few rotations. I'd been cleaning up after the previous supervisor's manual entry habits for 2 months. I logged the incident in the station's contact register. 1 line, Verek Syndicate representatives, 3 individuals, attempted to obtain supervisor's signature for cargo reclassification. Bay 11 sealed hold. Request declined, departed without incident. Then I scheduled the morning cargo movements, locked the bay register for the night shift, and went home. Orvith 3 is a small station. The quarters block is a 7-minute walk from the docking arm, through 2 connecting corridors and a pressurized bridge that looks out over the parking grid. It was empty transit hour, the mid-cycle quiet that falls between commercial traffic windows when the grid is mostly dark and the only sound is the station's own ventilation and the distant, mechanical patience of the docking clamps. I walked through it the way I'd walked through 100 similar corridors on 100 similar stations and didn't think much about anything at all. I had work in the morning. The morning had the 2nd priority load, the connector departure, and a calibration check on Bay 9's atmosphere sensor that had been on my list for a week. Predictable hours. I liked that. The contact register entry for the Verek incident stayed in the system exactly as filed. 3 weeks later, a routine IWC Transit Authority sweep flagged the syndicate's registration mark against the corridor's cargo integrity protocol and kicked an automated inquiry to their licensed broker. Nothing I initiated, nothing I followed up on. The system did what it was built to do. I don't know what happened to the factor. I didn't ask. It wasn't my department.